Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Beyond Pesticides. This is session 2 of the 40th National Forum entitled Forging a Future with Nature. And I am Paula Dinnerstein. I am the president of the board of Beyond Pesticides. And I wanted, first of all, to let everybody know that there will be a third session of this series on November 29th at 2 o'clock, and you can sign up. It's free, as they all are. Contributions welcome, of course, on the Beyond Pesticides website. Just to introduce myself for a moment, I've been the president of the board of Beyond Pesticides for a little over a year now, but I served on the board just as a member ever since 2006. And even long before that, I engaged in litigation on behalf of Beyond Pesticides, trying to take certain really bad pesticides off the market. In my day job, I am an attorney with a group called Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, and we're kind of an environmental whistleblower group. And we deal with pesticide issues, but also any other within a broad range of environmental issues. So if you know anybody who works for a government agency and is having problems, their science or their views being suppressed, you can refer them to peer. But for now, we are going to go on to this webinar. I think it's another view of how Beyond Pesticides is integrating all the crises of our times are all so interrelated with pesticides, with human health, biodiversity, climate change, and today also we will be focusing on environmental justice. And this is another indication to me of Beyond Pesticides' very broad view of what we're facing and how it all fits together. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jay Feldman, the executive director of Beyond Pesticides, to more specifically introduce the panel.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you for your service on the board of directors and all the work that you do. Welcome everybody again to the second session of the 40th National Forum, Forging a Future with Nature. So pleased to have you here with us today. With the world on the brink of ecosystem and social collapse, we take a moment at this forum session to envision and strategize for a sustainable world. Many are working on different tracks to help make this happen. Today, we focus on environmental justice because, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in a web, an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. This second session of the forum takes place in the context of widespread toxic chemical exposure through our communities and all strata of society, but with the recognition that there is disproportionate harm in society to people of color. The harm comes from high-risk occupational exposures, including farm workers, landscapers, chemical manufacturing, from chemical manufacturers' emissions in fence-line communities, from pesticide drift in agricultural communities, including nearby schools, and from toxic exposure to essential workers and those with pre-existing and multi-generational illness. People of color in the United States and around the world struggle with inequities that cause disproportionate risk in ways that are institutionalized in the economic and social system. A little bit of history on Beyond Pesticides. The organization grew out of a series of field hearings in the late 1970s. Under pressure from litigation, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, needed to create a record to support the development of a worker protection standard for farm workers who were not protected under occupational health and safety law, but were under the jurisdiction of an EPA regulatory standard that only said that farm workers must not re-enter the field until the sprays have dried and the dust have settled. It wasn't until 1992 that EPA adopted a more robust worker protection standard and then added access to drinking water and sanitation facilities. The standards are still subpar. Requirements for protective equipment in the heat of summer raise serious health risks, exemplifying that EPA's risk mitigation measures do not realistically protect those suffering disproportionate harm. When EPA calculates acceptable risk under US pesticide law, the agency by law does not calculate occupational exposure to pesticides on the farm as part of its cumulative risk assessment, adding all dietary and non-dietary risks. So farm workers and their families suffer elevated harm well above the general population. Limitations in EPA's risk assessment in the registration of pesticides allows threats to health, especially for those at disproportionate risk. Other serious regulatory inadequacies include the agency's failure to fully evaluate endocrine disruptors, which can cause cancer, reproductive, and other chronic effects, multi-generational effects, and mixtures of chemical exposures, to name a few of the limitations that have disproportionate adverse effect. This lack of adequate protection requires a shift to practices not reliant on pesticides, and that's how we get to certified organic policy and practices that eliminate toxic chemical exposures for those disproportionately exposed. The changes we are advancing, as we discussed in session 1 of the forum in September, you can see a recording on the Beyond Pesticides website, offers a path forward that is not new, but gaining momentum as an alternative to chemical-intensive practices and products. The value of organic systems was discussed by George Washington Carver at the Tuskegee Institute's Agricultural Experiment Station in the early 1900s, when he wrote, "Many thousands of dollars are being spent every year in the South for fertilizers that profit the user very little, while nature's choicest fertilizer is going to waste." He advocated for the use of on-farm compost to assist with soil fertility, also reducing the financial debt of Black farmers in the South. We have made great strides in adopting organic land management strategies. These strategies can greatly reduce serious threats to our health, biodiversity, and climate, and disproportionate risk to people of color. Today's forum will be a conversation about adopting with two deep thinkers and change makers celebrated in their fields. They have studied and written about the longstanding social, economic, and health problems related to pesticides and disproportionate harm to people of color. I will moderate this conversation. First, Marcos Orellana, PhD, is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, an expert in international law and the law on human rights and the environment. His recent reports in South Africa and Australia capture the significance of his work across the globe for critical truths and environmental justice. He has intervened in cases before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, and the World Trade Organization's appellate body. His practice in the climate space includes representing the 8 Nations Independent Association of Latin America and the Caribbean in the negotiations of the Paris Agreement on climate change. Dr. Orellana also teaches at the American University Washington College of Law. Second, Jayson Maurice Porter, PhD, also joining us today, is an environmental historian of Mexico and the Americas and teaches science and technology and studies material culture and Black geographies in Latin America. Dr. Porter focuses on oilseeds, agrochemicals, environmental justice, and ecological violence. He is on the editorial board of the North American Congress on Latin America and a Voss postdoctoral fellow at the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society, and recently began teaching in the Department of History at the University of Maryland, College Park. Let us begin with the first questions. We put this in the category of introductory remarks. So I welcome Dr. Orellana and Dr. Porter to the screen. There you go. Thank you. Welcome. Let me start with you, Dr. Orellana, and then we'll go to Dr. Porter. In terms of introductory remarks, how has the United Nations and you and your work defined human rights as a strategy for fighting environmental racism? How do structural, legislative, economic, and environmental changes intersect with achieving environmental justice?
Well, thank you, Jay, for the invitation to join this conversation. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity also to join Dr. Porter in this exchange. So there are various questions there, and I thought I'd answer them by reflecting on the mandate that has been conferred to me by the United Nations Human Rights Council. Many of you may be familiar with this organ of the United Nations. The Council is tasked with promoting observance of human rights around the world. It reports to the UN General Assembly. And in order to carry out that task, it has set up a system of special procedures that have been described as the eyes and ears of the institution. In a way, it's a form of connecting with reality. Back in 1995, the mandate on toxics and human rights was created. I have been in this mandate for 3 years now. I have 3 more years to go, having been just renewed in it. It was created at the behest of the African group at the United Nations that was quite concerned at the time about the generation and dumping of hazardous wastes in the African continent. The wastes were generated largely in Europe and then put on vessels and taken to African ports and dumped in various parts of the continent. The African group denounced this practice as an affront against global environmental justice, as a form of neo-environmental colonialism, as an expression of structural racism, and as a crime against humanity, a crime against the environment. And so from the outset of the Toxics and Human Rights Mandate's creation, the issue of environmental justice was built into the DNA of the mandate. The mandate seeks to bring a human rights approach into issues concerning hazardous wastes. That is how it was framed when it was created back in 1995. It was, at the time, quite a controversial mandate because European countries felt that it was a mandate created to point the blame and the finger against them. So they voted against, the US also voted against this mandate, and the countries that voted against it did everything they could to undermine it. All that began to change back in 2011 when the mandate was reframed and to address the life cycle of chemicals and wastes. So no longer just the transboundary movement and the dumping of hazardous waste north to south, but now the life cycle and the management of chemicals and wastes, and this in the understanding that exposure to hazardous substances can have a whole range of adverse impacts on the effective enjoyment of human rights. And I'll come back to that in a minute to elaborate further, Jay, on the specifics of your question. So a couple of the tools that the mandate has to carry out their work or its work, thematic reports are one of them. So I, as a special rapporteur, will report to the UN Human Rights Council once a year. I will report to the UN General Assembly once a year. I was in New York last week reporting on my latest report on shipping, toxics, and human rights. So the impacts of shipping around the world on human rights. Thematic reports are certainly relevant to the issue of pesticides because I'll mention 2 examples. One, my first report to the UN Human Rights Council spoke about and elaborated on the right to science, and it spoke about disinformation and the gap that exists between the best available science that we have access to, or in other words, what we know, and on the other hand, the protections that have been established to address the risks and harms associated with exposure to hazardous substances. This gap is not an accident. It is the result of deliberate disinformation or misinformation. Some firms that make a profit out of distributing doubt, distributing confusion, distributing false information, because every day that passes is a day that certain corporate interests continue to make a profit on the backs of those who suffer from the exposure to hazardous substances. So there's the right to science. My predecessor in the mandate, in collaboration with the Special Rapporteur on the right to food, put out a special thematic report on pesticides. And one of the conclusions that they arrive at is that it's a big myth that pesticides are needed in order to feed the world. This is the kind of disinformation, a tale that's pushed by industry in order to continue to reap profits. But in reality, there are alternatives that are non-toxic and that can secure food security. In addition to thematic mandates, there are country visits. This year, I had the opportunity to visit Australia, the most recent, and also South Africa. In previous years, last year, I went to Ghana and to Paraguay. These are visits carried out by invitation of the government. So they're an official country visit, and they conclude with a report to the UN Human Rights Council. You will find those online in the website of the Office of the High Commissioner. I think we can speak more to those visits as they relate to pesticides in a few minutes. But all of this is relevant to pesticides because when it comes to exposure and human rights, exposure to pesticides can have serious adverse impacts on the enjoyment, say, of the right to life. There are millions of people around the world that every year die as a result of exposure, mainly workers, but also local communities affected by the drift in aerial spray. There are many millions more that every year fall ill as a result to exposure to hazardous pesticides, Parkinson's, various forms of cancer, so serious diseases associated with exposure. So the rights to life, the right to health, the right to physical integrity for people that may acquire disabilities, whether it's neurotoxics or intellectual coefficient or malformations at birth, some of which the disabilities may be passed on in the DNA to future generations. The right to culture is also involved. There's a recent decision by the UN Human Rights Committee. This is a committee that oversees compliance and implementation with one of the key foundational international treaties on civil and political rights of the United Nations, that has examined a case involving Paraguay and communities therein exposed to hazardous pesticides aerially sprayed. The committee concluded that Paraguay had failed to enforce its laws, and as a result, people were being exposed to hazardous substances. And this had a range of implications for human rights. One person had died, several people had been taken in emergency to the hospitals. And the Human Rights Committee concluded that these were affronts to the rights to life, among other rights. But I do want to mention cultural rights, because for indigenous peoples that are disproportionately burdened by the impacts of exposure to hazardous pesticides, the connection with the land is severed, and that can implicate cultural rights. So much more could be said about exposure and human rights. I do want to also say a minute about international regulations, because the Special Rapporteur I engage international policy making, multilateral environmental treaties that concern themselves with pesticides, developments, gaps, and shortcomings. We can come back to this in the Q&A. But a couple of things. Highly hazardous pesticides, trade thereof is largely still allowed, even in countries that have banned them, because these substances are hazardous to human health or the environment. That is the case in the European Union. For example, I've been to speak at the European Parliament about these issues. The European Union legislation allows for the production of pesticides that are banned for use, but nevertheless allowed for export, and often exported to developing countries, poor countries that lack the resource and capacity to adequately manage the risks. And so this is a form of modern day exploitation. The racial element cannot be ignored here as well. And it is a practice of double standards that must come to an end. There's so much more that could be said, and I'm sure we'll have a back and forth Q&A, but in terms of introduction, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Orellana. And the same goes for the United States, of course, with the exportation of banned or voluntarily withdrawn pesticides in the US for health and environmental reasons. I should say we will have time at the end of this session for conversation discussion with participants. Dr. Porter, again, under introductory comments, some suggested questions. How do you define environmental racism and environmental justice response? Why is it important to you as a historian? Why is it important to understand history in this context? And what elements of history have contributed to environmental racism?
Yes, I'm also grateful to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Sorry I couldn't make it last year. Question, is this introductory remarks or are we jumping into the first questions?
Introductory.
Okay, is that including the first question as well that you just asked?
Yeah, you can, you have flexibility here to go in any direction, but the idea is, being an historian, we don't often have historians in this conversation. We should, of course. And so the question was, how do you relate the importance of history in the context of understanding environmental racism and environmental justice?
So the role of history, especially in terms of conversations around policy and changes today, there is a large gap. It's such a large gap. It really begs the question, what is the role of history and historical information in understanding these? I've read reports. I've read hundreds, if not thousands, of reports from governments on pesticides, and oftentimes they're country specific or region specific or time specific or presentist in a way that doesn't necessarily always acknowledge the larger processes that have brought us to this point and the deeper connections that connect things like colonialism and imperialism and racism to what we experience now, as so well articulated around the structural racism and decisions that disproportionately impact poorer people, poorer countries, poorer people within countries, rich or lower income, with smaller economies. So in terms of thinking about, I don't necessarily know, or I don't have too much to say in terms of introducing myself, but I would say that I think the role of history, at least for me, has a lot to do with political education. I think a lot of it for me is how to talk with youth about this, how to talk to young people, how to talk to college students. I was at Williams College this morning talking to students. I work with students at Brown. I've worked with hundreds of students from across the country just since I've graduated a year ago, to talk about these issues. And I really do think, I mean, that's something I think policymakers and officials have to really reckon with, is the importance of history, because there is a deep gap in it. But the elements do, I think, are important. I think, for my own interests or for my own research, I think, building off of arguments from, there was a recent book in 2001 by Max Liberayan about pollution as colonialism. And largely the argument is that, our proximity to elements, whether or not they're toxic or not, isn't what necessarily, the exposure isn't necessarily what comes from the element itself or the toxin itself. Toxins may or may not be toxic to people, but the proximity oftentimes comes from the decisions that are, either stem from policy, or they stem from longer processes like colonialism, or policies that inform from colonialism. So I think that's an important thing to oftentimes to think about deeply, is how colonial logics, how political decisions put people in proximity to be exposed. In terms of historical connections and matters, I think, I studied most closely the first generation of pesticides that were mostly made from arsenic. I think this is really important, particularly in the Americas, and in other parts of the country that experience a lot of naturally occurring arsenic contamination, because the mixture of the two, naturally occurring arsenic contamination and the use of arsenic pesticides, is something that has put a lot of people at harm's risk. In the context of Latin America, over 5 million people are exposed to arsenic contaminated water, not to mention food. And a lot of this comes from the history of volcanic activity that stems from the Ring of Fire. So from Canada all the way up to Argentina, you have, a geological history that is predisposed two continents to large amounts of arsenic in the bedrock. Now, how does this arsenic cycle, then become disrupted, similar to how humans have disrupted the carbon cycle to adversely affect people? That usually has historically happened through colonialism and, and the case of mining. So mining, arsenic is a byproduct of mining. And it wasn't until, the late 19th century, early 20th century, that cattle farmers and farmers, called the alarm and said, around the smelters and, mining either in Canada or in Mexico or the United States or in Argentina, you had farmers and cattle ranchers, saying that, okay, what's going on here? And here's where you have a really interesting issue. Miners don't like arsenic in their ore. Miners are charged if there's a high amount of arsenic in their ore. So they don't necessarily particularly want it, but so for them to capture it and collect it added another burden. They called it nuisance value, right? And what was really interesting, it really wasn't until the emergence of the first really robust pesticide industry, which had been trying to articulate itself, from the wake of enslavement to or wake of abolition of slavery to kind of the 1910s, that smelters and miners had the kind of the market value in the arsenic to then sell it somewhere, right? I mean, there was glass manufacture, a little bit in medicine, a little bit in perfumes and here, this, that, and the third, but it really wasn't until this. So right there you have in this moment, right, between 1909, 1914, back in the day, where in the United States context, the FDA still was the FDIA, was the Federal Department for Insecticides and, administration, right? In this moment, you really see how in terms of the cost benefit analysis, profits are always central, right? And, in terms of figuring out how to dispose of waste, right? And I think waste has oftentimes been, at least in the early history of pesticides, waste, and even to, as articulated by Dr. Orellana about the start of the mandate in 1995 in the context of Africa, toxins being wasted, the use of waste in capitalism to seek profits. All right, there's so many stories coming out of West Africa around people who have dug in these wastes, fills to find profits and find, some type of source of revenue out of these. And I think that the use of waste, that's the way capitalism, either considers laborers as a form of waste or considers these toxins as a form of waste to be transformed into pesticides or into fertilizers, is something that's pretty consistent, I think, from the late 19th century to today. So just to kind of say that again in a different way, because I mentioned the abolition of slavery. It's really interesting that you see technology, particularly pesticides and fertilizers, play a role in the abolition of enslaved people of African descent, at least in the American context, right? Starting in 1860, you see a rise of use of fertilizers and pesticides, not just in the United States, but across the Americas, across the Caribbean basin. It's in small amounts at first, right? But pesticides and fertilizers begin to replace, enslaved labor. At this moment, plantation owners begin to see the enslaved people the formerly enslaved people as disposable, right? And that kind of that relationship between the disposability of labor and the nuisance value of a waste product that can be rearticulated into a chemical is something that I think, or something that's profitable, I think is something that's pretty consistent. And I think that seeing these historical patterns matter a lot, but there are very big differences between generations of pesticides, from the first generation to the second, third, and now we're probably in like the 30th generation, right? So I think I think it's something that we all have to reckon with as we try to educate ourselves, as we try to educate the youth, because the youth across the world are the people who are really mobilizing a lot of these efforts on the ground, be it in Central Valley or in Southern Mexico. So I think that's something we have to reckon with in terms of the role of history in these conversations, because I think a lot of it does not necessarily reach policymakers and officials really pushing new and improved ways of growing things and caring for one another.
Thank you. I mean, that's great context. Both introductory remarks, I think, set the stage for how we begin to think about concepts that, we don't necessarily relate to in the present, like disposability of people, disposability of resources, exploitation. These are concepts that I think we need to bring to the policy context and question principles and values that are embedded in our policies. And to that end, the next topic area we've entitled Inequities Worldwide, and starting with you, Dr. Orellana, sorry. Much of what you discuss in your public statements in terms of basic human rights, or basic human right for a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment should be a universal concept for all humanity, it would seem. But we know that it is not the case. Within and between countries, you already mentioned the EU and export of banned chemicals. How would you best describe what you have witnessed in your travels and written about regarding the conditions that led to and support the continuing disproportionate harm in societies and in workplaces? You've made speeches, brought data. A lot of your work is really hard hitting. How do you feel that is received, and do the folks receiving this, particularly policymakers, do they get the structural issues that are at stake here in terms of the institutionalization of this disproportionate harm being foisted on segments of society?
Thanks, Jay, for that question. There is no doubt a huge challenge in increasing, amplifying planetary awareness of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. If we look back in time, the first moment in human history where the environment was addressed as a matter of global concern was in 1972 at the so-called Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. That conference dealt with environment largely through the lens of pollution. Many things have changed since, but I go back to that moment in time because there were some countries, including the United States, which afterwards changed its position, but there were a number of countries that advocated at that conference for the recognition, the global recognition of a new right, a new human right, the right to a healthy environment. If we look further back in time, this year, there's a celebration of 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the seminal document that really changed the basis of legitimacy for world governments. That document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, does not refer to a right to a clean or healthy or sustainable environment anywhere. And that is not because there was opposition to inclusion. It is simply because it had not entered the realm of consciousness or of our human awareness. 75 years later, there is a growing movement to recognizing that humanity has exceeded the planetary boundaries of what is a safe space and trying very hard to use all tools at its disposal to bring back humanity into a space of sustainability. That's also where the right to a healthy environment comes in. Last year, in 2022, last August, the UN General Assembly, for the first time at the global level, recognized this right. It was a very contentious process, a lot of debate, but it was adopted. The resolution at the UNGA was adopted by consensus without any vote against. So while there was a vote, nobody voted against. This is a strong support to at least a political declaration on the right to a healthy environment. But then the challenge is how to take this and make it operational, make it justiciable, make it a reality in people's lives. In my experience as Special Rapporteur, as I mentioned earlier, I visit countries in an official capacity, and it's a bit of an X-ray into the situations in those countries. So when it comes to pesticides, to give an example, I visited South Africa recently, where I found that the regulator has very limited tools to work with in terms of resources. Information on the pesticides that are allowed for use in South Africa, for example, is only available for purchase through a CropLife website, CropLife being an industry association. So this speaks to the public interest information and limitations therein. Questions about inaccessibility of protective equipment, lack of information thereof, disinformation, imports of pesticides that are banned elsewhere. All of this begins to speak of quite a cozy relationship between industry and the regulator that has been described as corporate capture. So I point that out in my end of mission statement. I'll be preparing a 10,000 words report to the Council on that visit. And the way it is received, so I have briefings with government and meetings with government officials, and many of them are aware of the problems that they face in terms of resources and regulatory limitations. And sometimes feel that what is needed is stronger political will in order to enforce adequately laws that exist or change laws where they should be changed. In South Africa, the dramatic situation of street pesticides, for example, where agricultural pesticides are sold illegally in markets in slow doses and sold to people that want to combat vermin, so rats and cockroaches. I mean, I learned about situations where rats would eat babies' noses and ears, and of course it's serious, and so they interface with poverty and slums. But then many children end up finding these pesticides, eating them, and then dying. And so the human rights dimension of this problem is severe. These are a few examples of the kinds of interface and messaging and the challenges that are needed in order to make the right to a healthy environment, the right to live in a non-toxic environment, a reality for all.
Thank you for that. And, you know, we're aware of corporate capture and what that means to the political decision-making process. Dr. Porter, in your, and it's interesting, Dr. Orellana, you know, that you're sitting in a room with people that have the power to make political decisions that protect humanity. And we're going to get to later, you know, how that plays out, actually. But Dr. Porter, in your study of history, and you've already mentioned the role of capitalism and the role of corporations in allowing and even benefiting from and capitalizing on exploitation and disposability of environment and people and human resources. Given your studies, you know, how do we get an analysis that we can use in bringing some sanity to the political process if the political process is controlled by the corporations? I know that's may not have an answer to that question, but I think we need to explore it for a minute.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that question necessarily, but I do think in the context of the exportation of pesticides that are manufactured, let's say in the United States or the UK, that are illegally used in the United States and the UK, but they're exported elsewhere, I think something that also disrupts are a lot of countries who have their own national chemical industries, right? So Brazil, for instance, or Argentina or Mexico, who have been producing agrochemicals on their own for almost 100 years. When chemicals are then dumped in their countries from the United States or the UK, they're still trying to find market space for their national chemical industry. So in countries like Costa Rica, Brazil, Mexico, you see an extra use of chemicals that are being used, and there's a black market for chemicals that are being used just because of the national chemical industries that have been historically producing insecticides on their own. So I think that's part of the equation I you don't oftentimes hear about, is how that impacts national chemical industries. But to give a couple of examples around kind of corporations and kind of patterns that kind of stem, I think the American Smelting and Refining Company is a helpful one. They were the largest arsenic producer until 1985. And they captured the market through their large smelters in Mexico and in Canada and Western United States. And a lot of that was connected to another company that became the largest cotton producer in the world until it sold its holdings to Quaker Oats in the same year, 1985. And that company was Anderson-Clayton. Anderson-Clayton, from the US South, and particularly in Texas, spread its cotton holdings into Mexico, Brazil, and other parts of Latin America. But in order to do that, it required arsenic and ultimately required DDT and eventually required other chemicals as the list went on. So I think it's interesting to see how some of these major companies move and have close connections with government. So in the context of Mexico, I think in the 1930s, 36 or 1937, Anderson-Clayton lost tens of thousands of acres of cotton land to collective farmers in Mexico, but did not lose the right to sell arsenic there, to buy the cotton, to provide the technology. So I think you see over time, even forms of like agrarian reform, even at the collective level, can be co-opted at the national level through corporations. So Anderson Clayton continued to be a fixture in the cotton production, both in the United States and Mexico and in Brazil, through its relationship with collective farmers, through government negotiation strategies that maintain the use of, and then so in where this happened in Anderson Clayton, ended up being one of the largest use kind of pools of DDT in the 1960s, became one of the largest kind of sources for arsenic poisoning in the 1960s, which really kind of called the alarm across Latin America to look into arsenic poisoning. So I think I can't really speak to political will as well as Dr. Orellana can, but I do think there are a lot of examples, and I think maybe this is a reason why history matters, because there's a lot of examples that not necessarily we can learn from, that we can protect and that we can show, because history is a constant battle. If you know anything about working with corporations and you know working about governments, especially when it deals with chemicals, you have to deal with information that's constantly being, as was alluded to earlier, it's constantly being erased. It's constantly not being written down. It's the levels at which something can either not be recorded or recorded in part, or recorded and hidden, or recorded and destroyed are numerous. And so I think the active work of trying to retain history is part of the political process of making sure that folks see the oftentimes nefarious actions of corporations and governments in these kind of processes and networks.
Interesting. And we're going to drill down a little bit more on that as sort of a case study. You've already mentioned specific corporations, specific crops, in this case cotton, that I think serve as examples to exemplify patterns of abuse. And maybe we can drill down a little bit more on that in this next topic area. Switching back to you, Dr. Orellana, you're familiar with the fact that farm workers in, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this correctly, Paarl, South Africa, Paarl, took to the streets back in September, marching to the headquarters of Bayer, demanding an end to indiscriminate importation of exactly what you were talking about earlier, coming in from the European Union. These were pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides containing substances prohibited by the EU. This protest is part of a broader global trend, I assume. I mean, we're seeing it, an outcry against systemic issues of environmental racism that disproportionately burden communities. This action actually came on the heels of your report on the reality of post-apartheid legacy, that, as you have said, I'm quoting you, despite the efforts by government in setting up institutions and laws to address this legacy of environmental racism, pervasive air, water, and chemical pollution still imposes a heavy toll, especially on disadvantaged communities. First of all, do you have security when you travel to these countries? No. First, describe the conditions. And then second, as the UN rapporteur, what recommendations have you made, for instance, in South Africa, that could apply to other countries? Because, in many ways, what you're describing and seeing are, maybe on a smaller scale, maybe on a similar scale. We're seeing embedded in institutions in the developed world as well.
Thank you, Jay, for that question. So, in terms of security, there's all kinds of protocols that are in place, and one big element there is to make sure that no one that speaks to a special rapporteur or a special procedure of the Human Rights Council suffers retaliation because of that. I did have the opportunity to meet a number of people that participated in that protest that you describe, women's organization in in western in the south of the country, close to Cape Town, organized, and they have been denouncing exposure to hazardous pesticides for years, including the issue of double standards. So they've spoke to me about, for example, being forced to work in fields right after spraying takes place, not having protective equipment, not having access to a toilet, even drinking water. So working in very, very difficult conditions. They spoke to me about health impacts, their husbands, several stories where women talked about their husbands dying, they themselves having terminal cancer, and mobilizing for others in the movement to gain awareness of the risks associated with exposure to hazardous pesticides there. In the terms of my mandate, I had the opportunity to write letters to Germany, where Bayer is based, in regards to this issue of double standards. So again, the export of pesticides that are banned for use in their country of origin, but nevertheless allowed for production for export. The answer by Germany is that this was a matter that was better dealt with at the regional level by the EU. The EU took a very important step in its chemical strategy for sustainability, where it pledged to put an end to this odious, abhorrent practice, and yet it has dragged its feet, and several years have passed, and we see no change in the regulations, and so the practice continues. The issue of highly hazardous pesticides was addressed most recently in the International Conference on Chemicals Management. So this is ICCM for the acronym, the fifth session of that conference. This is the space where the global framework for chemicals is debated, discussed, and negotiated. 2 weeks ago, maybe was it 3, the meeting took place in Bonn, and it was able to deliver a global framework. And so there may be steps towards the phase out of highly hazardous pesticides at a worldwide level. So this is quite welcome. It takes time. There's at times the argument that there needs to be a kind of a phase out period, a year or two, but this is antithetical to human rights enjoyment, because once it has been determined that a specific chemical or pesticide is hazardous to human health and the environment, allowing people to continue to be exposed for another year has no justification. This is only to deal with industry stocks and the issues of wastes and how to manage those wastes. So there's that. And in terms of the recommendations, I'll say part of your question, I'll say two things. One, last year, I had an opportunity to present a report to the UN General Assembly on indigenous peoples and toxics. In the preparation of that report, I consulted the indigenous peoples movement in various parts of the world. And one issue that comes out is the environmental injustice, systematic, widespread of the spraying of pesticides that affect disproportionately indigenous peoples in so many places of our planet. As a result of that report and one of its recommendations, the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization have begun a process of revising their code of conduct, their code of pesticide management, in order to better protect indigenous people's rights. Currently, the code doesn't refer to indigenous peoples at all, so they are made invisible. So we see steps that are going in the right direction, but we also see a number of practices that are abhorrent to the enjoyment of human rights that are continuing.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that gives us really clear perspective on the ground effects. Dr. Porter, you know, again, I come back to you on economics again. you've written about plantation agriculture and how pesticides integrate into plantation agriculture and the effect that our social structure, which embraced slavery, had in that plantation context. And then you're also tying arsenic in with that as well. I'm wondering, in the aftermath of slavery, maybe slavery's taken a different form, if you could address that, how the structure of agriculture has continued, the same type, perhaps, maybe, with different words and different contexts, the exploitation of labor, the exploitation of people, and the continued use of deadly chemicals in agriculture. Do you see elements of history, of this history playing out today?
Yeah, I would say just in regards, I mean, in many regards, I think, I mean, there's the around the disposability of labor. I still think you see that a lot, especially, I mean, I'm more familiar with the context in Latin America, in the United States, where, many plantation economies, especially around corn, for corn syrup and numerous products, or soy, or for, African palm oil, some of the largest plantation economies that have hundreds of thousands of acres in territories today, they don't require much labor. A lot of the technology packages that are sent from these big businesses like Cargill to part of, let's say, Las Pampas in Argentina, to grow, 100,000 acres of soy. Those are technology packages that come with technicians, a couple engineers, a couple of folks who, run a couple of shops, monitor, a few of the things, but they don't require 100, 200 laborers to work a couple thousand hectares, right? And I think that that's something that's really, we started to see with since NAFTA in the United States, is the disposability of labor. Oftentimes, people it's not, we talk about the Central Valley and exposure and drift to, farm workers, but in large parts of the world where plantations look like oceans, right? All you can see, they're not dependent on labor in the same way. So I think that that's something that's really interesting. And that's part of the reason why so many people are left to downhill effects of pesticides, are oftentimes just flat out killed when people speak up, right? So the largest, highest proportion of, environmental activists who have been killed are oftentimes fighting against, these plantation economies that not only bring chemicals into a space, but bring those chemicals and those seeds into a space that actively undermines labor and does not use for labor. And I think one thing that's also interesting, and I don't, in terms of thinking about the Green Revolution, right, is think about, oftentimes I feel like the Green Revolution in many ways, in setting up a global conversation about how we're going to eat, right? And who's going to disseminate the technologies and the seeds that help us eat as a society, as a global society. It feels like in many ways, many countries that, were basically told or situated in contexts where their largest institutes of technology, their biggest investments in science would be agricultural ones, right? You look at the largest institutes in technology and science in Indonesia or in India or in Brazil or in Mexico. Oftentimes they're rooted into extraction. They're rooted directly into extraction of land or extraction of oil, or, and I think that those types of patterns that you see oftentimes stem from the conversations of environmentalism that oftentimes are rooted in temperate climates, that and in temperate places. I don't necessarily always use the term global north or developing south type words, but environmentalism, as the globe has come together time and time again to have conversations of how we should take care of the world, that form of environmentalism, I still think, stems from a notion that good environmental thinking, or the best environmental thinking, comes from certain places, from certain people, and that the burden of environmental justice is always squarely on poor people, poor countries, poorer communities, right? And I think that that's something that we see consistent. I mean, it generally larger conversation around environmentalism, be it, 1972 Stockholm or 1972, Water Acts and EPA, those burdens were placed on people of color. You mentioned Martin Luther King when you introduced this speech. Why was he shot in Memphis in 68? Because he was there marching with garbage workers, because the garbage disposal process of Memphis at that time was disproportionately put on people of color. If you look at any city, burgeoning city, the waste products are disproportionately placed. The environmental discussions on what places, how we're going to keep a clean city, keep certain places cleaner in the city than others, right? Sometimes that waste is concentrated and sent abroad. Sometimes it's just sent down the street to a barrio instead of a colonia, right? Like in the context of Mexico City, where you have literally colonies and you have neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods adversely take the burden of holding the waste and the environmental justice initiatives of a city, right? So I think you see that at all scales. And I think one important conversation to have, I think, it's incredible to have someone who represents the UN. I was actually at this couple days ago, I was in DC in the room where the UN was formed in Dunbarton Oaks, having a conversation about Black gardening, right? And a lot of that conversation has to do with scale, right? And a lot of this conversation around environmental justice has to do with scale. And I think a lot of people of color, whether or not they're trying to get chemicals, if they're trying to get chemicals to, impact rats so they don't bite their children, it's largely because they don't trust top-down strategies of a government or a corporation to have their best interests, right? One poison or another, right? And I think that type of burden that's displaced on people of color, poor people, is something that's pretty cyclical. And you see that kind of stemming from kind of this gap, between conversations of scale. Can we have an international pesticide, or global pesticide conversation that's actually going to benefit poor people, right? I think poor people do not believe that. And as long as poor people do not believe that, they're going to seek other solutions, So I think that that's something, that lack of trust there, because where knowledge comes from and who it generally benefits, is something that's pretty continuous in these large scale debates that, set aside meetings to have with, Indigenous folks or poor people, but don't have them centered in the conversation on political economy and dissemination of knowledge and burdens.
One of the reasons we wanted to talk about, people organizing and rallying and bringing their voice directly to the doors of political decision-making and corporations is because, I think we need to recognize, that if we don't stand up and voice our concerns, either quietly as individuals in our purchasing decisions or our engagement with democracy, or support of others who are out on the front lines, that the change is not going to happen. And in this next section, I'm really interested in what you see as the elements of change that really drive the systemic change that's needed to meet the urgency of our time. I just, for a minute, personal privilege here, want to make sure everyone's aware of what's going on in Maui, Hawaii right now after the fires in Lahaina. This is an area that has been burdened for generations now by colonialism that structured the plantation-based agricultural system there. And, yes, a lot of the big plantations have left, the sugar people have left, and the county of Maui, which is the island of Maui, has really embraced the notion that we need to support small farmers. But one of the things that was discussed last year at our forum by Kaipo Kikana, who is now the president of the Farmers Union on the island, is rebuilding this town in the image of its ancestry, of its traditions. And to the extent that we can embrace that, what are the cultural traditions? What are the forms of agriculture that turned, that's protected the wetlands and the beautiful diversity and biodiversity in Maui that was destroyed by plantation agriculture? How do we get back to the original traditional agriculture? And what can we do all these miles away to support that? There's an article in the New York Times this weekend about what I'm discussing here. So we can't look at these things as far off, outside our realm, something we have no connection to, because the ecosystem of Maui affects climate, affects not only the culture, the individuals there, which deserve a decent life that embraces human rights and traditional culture, and the knowledge that has been lost, not, thank God, kept alive by Kaipo and his community. But now we have a chance to put it in place. So when we look at the work you're doing, Dr. Orellana, and you're in the room where it happens, and you've been a part of a lot of the international agreements, and we've got to think of these changes as, yes, community-based, but then how are we part of the world community? Because, we are a part of the world community, but how do we exercise that? And one of the things that is so distressing to me, having tracked this, is that the United States is party to very few international environmental treaties that you have been a party to in advancing, Dr. Orellana. And I'm wondering how we, as part of the global community, can engage to create some accountability that forces our elected representatives to recognize our role in the global community.
Thank you, Jay. So a couple of reflections on international instruments concerning the environment in regards to pesticides. Again, if we look back at since 1972, there's been one could even say an explosion of instruments on chemicals and waste and on environment more generally, going from very few to now many, and yet they are fragmented. There are many things that fall through the cracks. And perhaps fundamentally, they are also, I would argue, misaligned in terms of a rights-based approach, a human rights-based approach. Because what most intend to do is to manage risks, however defined, in a way that can minimize them. But minimizing risks in a way accepts that some people will be hurt, that we're minimizing in relation to something. It's a relative concept, of course. And from a human rights perspective, that's not acceptable. Everybody has the right to life, to health, to personal integrity, and to a healthy environment. So that's one very big consideration in terms of how to realign, how to reform, not just, you were speaking, Jay, earlier about, yes, incremental change, so in a way tweaking here and there and improving protections. But when something is misaligned, there needs to be structural change. And that's the place, that's the moment that we're in right now. And this fifth session of the International Conference on Chemicals Management that I referred to earlier could have provided that moment, but we saw countries that could have been leaders and that have been leaders at times in the field litigating or arguing against effective protections. And that includes the United States, arguing against a strong right to a healthy environment being recognized in the vision of this instrument. Without a vision, the instrument begins to lose strength. There are various international instruments that concern pesticides at the global level. Even the Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting substances the ozone layer. Well, one of the chemicals that has that potential is methyl bromide, widely used as a pesticide, especially for international trade. Now, in the design of that instrument and several others, the instruments contain possibilities for exemptions. So that's to bring more countries to participate in the regime, to make them feel comfortable. That's the terminology often used, or also the terminology of the flexibilities needed in order to account for the differing circumstances among countries. Well, I had a country visit to Australia, as I mentioned, and Australia is a participant party to the Montreal Protocol, but it has obtained exemptions for methyl bromide time after again, and it has no plan to phase out methyl bromide. So in that situation, the exemptions begin to operate as a gap and even as a loophole to the effectiveness or undermining the effectiveness of the instrument. Similar could be said about the Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants and issues concerning DDT in that instrument. That instrument also bans and restricts a number of other hazardous pesticides. But I do want to mention the situation of the Rotterdam Convention on international trade in industrial chemicals and pesticides. Because that instrument, it is a pretty basic instrument of the right to know. So an importing country having the right to know what is the chemical assessment of the chemical or pesticide that it is importing. And yet, those controls, they depend on chemicals, pesticides being included in an annex, so listed. For a pesticide to be listed, there needs to be consensus of the conference of the parties in that instrument, and repeatedly the conference of the parties has ignored the advice of the Chemical Review Committee, so the scientific body, and failed to list chemicals and pesticides that are notorious, where there's no scientific uncertainty. We don't even need to discuss the precautionary principle there. Paraquat is a very clear example, so a hazardous pesticide, and yet the Rotterdam Convention unable to control it. Asbestos, to mention a couple others. And that breakdown of science policy interface is having, I would say, a serious adverse effect on human rights enjoyment worldwide. So as much as the implementation of the right to a healthy environment also depends on the effective implementation of these multilateral environmental agreements, well, international treaties often have gaps that make them limited protections at best.
Let me just follow up quickly on this. This is a larger conversation, but it's the elephant in the room. The United States typically struggles politically with its relationship with the United Nations. We even have a candidate running for president now who just announced that he would withdraw the US from the United Nations and NATO. So just anti-global, I guess, in terms of cooperation. What do you say to those who have lost faith in the international body and the need to work in concert and collaboration with the global community? What do you say to those people?
So a couple of things. I think this ties to one point in your earlier question as to the situation in South Africa, for example. So the situation in South Africa in respect of pesticides, for example, so the lack of capacity. South Africa is perhaps the strongest economy in Africa. If South Africa lacks the capacity to manage imports and otherwise the use of pesticides in its territory, what can we expect that would happen, or that does happen in other countries in the continent? Well, the answer is pretty straightforward. The lack of capacity means either that there's self-regulation of industry, that there's corporate capture, that people in the fields are exposed to hazardous pesticides. So speaking and reflecting to what Dr. Porter was speaking of earlier, this distribution in the global political economy of burdens and harm, some countries, some peoples condemned by design to suffer the impacts of hazardous substances while others profit from that. So international trade is an element of that. That's where the United Nations and the ability to channel global cooperation becomes so critical. Perhaps in a country like the United States, that is not apparent at first sight, but for other countries, especially the poorest countries in the world, having the assistance of the United Nations and of the international community can make the difference between stability or chaos, can make the difference between being able to turn on the light or there being a blackout, or the difference between going hungry or not, or having food on the table.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Dr. Porter, this is always a hard, difficult question. But one I think we look to consistently, where we look at history and say, where are the lights of hope? Where are the examples of success that we can grab onto to give us some guidance? Are there experiences in fighting for environmental justice that give us some guidance in moving forward in this somewhat bleak time we live in? Another unfair question.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Definitely not my wheelhouse as a historian. But I would say I think one thing that's a problem with environmental justice is that it's too US centric. So I think there's a really interesting tension here where the United States is not always privy or supportive of kind of international conversations on environmental justice. But environmental justice is very much something that historiographically, even genealogically and epistemologically, is something that's rooted in the United States, particularly communities of color in the United States. So I say all that because I want to mention the mother of environmental justice, Hazel Johnson, who started the idea of the toxic donut in the context of, post-World War II Southside Chicago. The government gives Black veterans one of the largest project buildings in urban planning designed for Black communities to date in the 1940s, but they situate it in the center of an industrial zone. And asthma rates and cancer rates become so problematic that they start the first kind of environmental justice coalition that really starts the environmental justice movement, one of the first iterations of the environmental justice movement in the United States. So I think Hazel Johnson and her daughter is still one of the biggest activists today. And I had the opportunity of working with youth in the city of Chicago, developing an environmental justice freedom school to work with Cheryl Johnson. So that's an example, but I think generally is young people. I think young people everywhere around the world are the ones that are fed up with kind of how older generations have dealt with some of these questions. And I think it's really making sure that we have these conversations in ways that young people can feel a part of them and also feel informed, because they're the ones boots on the ground, more or less pushing some of these agendas, and I think it's really, I think Dr. Orellana is completely correct that we can't give up hope at the international level. We have to have some faith. You have to move with faith. We build the roads while walking. I mean, that's how you do this type of work. But at the same time, I think we need to be constantly investing, constantly having this conversation with young people. Because as young people who are going to have, we're not going to see the end of these issues in our lifetime. Unfortunately, I don't believe that's going to happen. And we might not see it in the generation behind us might not see it either. But I have faith in young people to push and see this through. you know? So I
Yeah.
think it's just making sure that these conversations, I mean, oftentimes we talk about where knowledge circulates, right? Where knowledge doesn't circulate. This happens on many levels. Sometimes this is within certain countries. Sometimes this is with certain institutions, but sometimes there's a generational gap. So I think that's something that young people are going to do, and they've been taking the initiative already, you know, pushing this. They're giving their lives around the world. You know, people in their teens and 20s are literally losing their lives fighting, you know, plantation encroachment and enclosure, right? And I think that they, just as much as poor countries, are left without their resources, left out of conversations, right? So I think that that generally is something that gives me faith, is that I always can turn. You know, I'm very lucky that I get to work with so many different institutions, be it Yale, Harvard, or, you know, high schools and, you know, nonprofits across the country, to make sure that young people feel a part of this conversation and start pushing these and continue pushing these agendas, right? Because it is really them. So for an example, I'll say Hazel Johnson, because I think as a just a pioneer, she's a good reminder of what it takes, but also a good reminder that there are vernaculars to environmental justice. Oftentimes we situate environmental justice as something that starts after the civil rights movement, because it very much was something that was informed by the civil rights movement and pushed forward. But there are earlier iterations of environmental justice, right? And around the world, there are early iterations of environmental justice movements. And I think that that's something really cool that we can look to as well, you know, not just in the United States, but I think the history of India, the histories in Mexico, histories in Brazil are all full of environmental justice leaders that just didn't label themselves as that, right? And I think it's really, really showing, you know, one of my kind of heroes right now, Berunda L. Montgomery, plant biologist, writes really beautiful things on the lessons we can learn from plants, particularly Black feminist ones. She likes to say, I might be a PhD in botany, but I'm not the first botanist in my family. You know, I come from an ancestry of botanists, and I feel very similar as somebody who is from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, you know, from sharecroppers and you know, farm workers, and from the same place where Harriet Tubman started her Underground Railroad moving up north, you know. And I like to imagine that, you know, I come from a long lineage of people who had deep historical knowledge of plants and had deep historical care for the world around them, but also were adversely affected by, you know, the decisions of politicians and state officials. So I'll throw that out there, that, you know, have some trust in yourself to have that communication or that conversation with the youth around you, because they're the ones that are going to pick this up. And they're the ones who've already been picking it up.
Thank you for that, and thank you for your leadership and support of youth in that work is so incredible. You know, we had left the last section here before the public conversation with participants on alternative strategies, and you've begun that conversation, Dr. Porter. But starting with you, Dr. Orellana, when you travel the world and, you know, you're seeing the challenges associated with environmental racism and the disproportionate harm and corporate behaviors that are in many ways inhumane. This is me speaking. I'm just gleaning that from your work. Do you see examples, and can you bring to decision makers examples of the flip side? Some of what Dr. Porter just mentioned, where we question, you had raised earlier a critical issue that gets lost in a lot of the conversations, that communities often recognize early on, as did George Washington Carver, that some of these tools that are being foisted on us by corporations we don't need, and that there are success stories, and the UN has documented some of these, UNEP has documented some of these. And is that something that's in the conversation when you're talking to particularly policymakers around treaties or around national policies?
Thanks, Jay. So some elements are in the conversations, there is an effort to make them part of the conversation. So, for example, I had the opportunity to visit the country of Ghana last year. There, I also documented challenges in regards to chemicals management, including pesticides, the issue of abandoned pesticide containers, for example, so the plastic jugs, where the pesticides come in being used to carry water or to store water, for that matter. So this is a big source of exposure. I mentioned Ghana because I had the opportunity in the north of the part of the country to meet with the extension officers of the agricultural ministry, to speak about what challenges that they are facing, and so to learn firsthand of how things can be made better. And extension, well, many of them that work directly with communities, they can also see firsthand the impacts, and they have ideas. And so, but they're often marginalized in the decision-making processes. And so how to connect those dots and for policy to be informed by the actual lived experiences of people on the ground, including people in government. So that's one challenge I would point to. Another aspect that I would point to also in relation to Ghana, for example, is the good practice of communities that are working without pesticides. Without any kinds of pesticides, so the connecting with the life cycles of the earth and the nutrients and so forth. That community has been able to autonomously thrive. I would say not just subsist, but thrive, and that's important example that there are alternatives. A similar experience I had, this is documented in my reports to the Human Rights Council. Another experience I had the opportunity to document is that of a community, agricultural community in Paraguay. Again, let's recall monocultures all around the country, environmental laws, agricultural laws that are not complied with blatantly. So, for example, the distance that should exist between a monoculture field that's sprayed and where people live. Those distances, the buffer zones, they're provided in law, but they're not complied with. They don't exist in reality. So in that context, to find an agricultural community that has been able to grow its food without pesticides, to have a university, a school within the community in order to pass on knowledge, peasant knowledge, traditional knowledge, that has been able to produce more food than what it needs, and so to offer food to others, that has put a lot of support to mobilization. And so that's a third angle that I would point to, in terms of good practices, things that are happening out there that are catalysts for change, mobilization of peasant movements, also mobilization of civil society organizations that engage these debates at various levels, be it regional or at the global level. The information they bring, the advocacy they conduct, the awareness that they raise in these spaces are very important for policymaking to reflect, to be guided and to reflect the needs of what should be done, the imperatives of human rights protections. So all of that is quite important, I would say. But then again, the resources by industry in terms of disinformation and pushing back are also significant, and so it's by no means an easy process. And finally, I would point that some countries are adopting strong measures to address the structural inequities and the global environmental injustices in the international trade of hazardous pesticides. I had the opportunity to visit Mexico, for example, where Sure, there are many challenges facing the country, but it has also adopted bans on the import of certain hazardous pollutants, glyphosate being an example of that.
Yeah.
And so, you know, this shows that it can be done. There are other examples that could be
Yeah,
mentioned.
that's a great example.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Porter, before we jump into a few questions from our participants, you jumped the gun on me here and gave us great alternative strategies. Are there any other things that you want to leave us with? Your previous discussion was extremely inspiring.
Yeah.
From history here.
Yeah, I'll give an example. I just heard this, and I'm just musing here. But I would have some pushback on the Mexican case because Mexico consists. I mean, there's still so many pockets where a large amount of a large amount of the export agriculture comes where at the state level, you know, over 100 banned, you know, agrochemicals are still flooded into states like Sonora and Sinaloa to really fund a lot of the ag. And then also I think Pemex, you know, the petroleum company always has this kind of economic nationalist perspective on trying to like corner their own kind of space for pesticides. I don't know. Mexico and pesticides market, that's like my bread and butter. And I wish I could really lean into that as a heartful example, but I can't personally. But what I will say is I was recently at this group conversation on Black gardening for the future as art and practice. And there was I think it was a conversation that was going between an English professor, I think her name is Kimberly Ruffin, and a horticulturist, Abra Lee. And we were talking basically about how did enslaved field workers, enslaved people, but then also formerly enslaved people who still had to do sharecropping and tenant farming and had most of their daytime hours kind of fixed at the plantation working on somebody else's land. How did they grow subsistence crops for themselves? You know? And one of the things that consistently came up in records, Kimberly was saying, was about moonlight farming and how, you know, across the South, there's so many different narratives around how enslaved people had to work the fields in the moonlight for subsistence crop. And it made me just wonder, one, just how does that still happen for people who have to spend their life, their daytime hours working for somebody else's land, somebody else's factory, somebody else's time, you know, have the opportunity to grow on their own. And Abra Lee, the horticulturist, made a comment about how, you know, doing a lot of the work at moonlight hours also has the added benefit of not having to worry about pesticides for a lot of the night critters. And how like just being in the field, just being present in the field might be something. And I know there's a lot of research going on right now about how in the context of climate change, a lot of people in the tropics are experiencing nighttime hour temperature rise is actually something that's increasing higher at a faster rate than daytime hours. So basically it's not getting cool as quick or as much in the evenings. And I think there's going to have to be a fundamental shift on some level about when people sleep, when people do certain activities, because a lot of this burden on people are experiencing extreme heat during the day or aren't able to cool down at evening is something that's I think is putting a lot of pressure on the world. So something I've just been thinking about after this conversation is, you know, this old kind of practice, you know, thinking about how poor people and people marginalized by systems are always actively working to make their lives more livable without the support of governments or institutions, right? It made me think of just this moonlight farming as this kind of anti-pesticide, kind of you know, capitalist, you know, way of, you know, just kind of thinking about this moonlight farming. And it's just something it really just tickled me the other day And it just made me think of just maybe the poetic possibilities more than the actual ones. But it just made me think that there could be something of note to following our ancestors practices of moonlight farming for a better world.
Interesting, really interesting. So bear with me, guys, for another half hour, if you don't mind. We have a lot of really deep, interesting questions. I think some of these we're going to need to package up and maybe continue a dialogue on this. They're really informed questions, and I feel bad leaving any of these out. But since we do have someone from the UN here, and you did mention crop life, Dr. Orellana, are you aware, have you been tracking at all the relationship that FAO has established with crop life, and does that impact your work at all? Is that something that's come up on your radar?
Yeah, thanks, Jay, and thanks for the question. So a couple of years ago, the Food and Agriculture Organizations had decided to explore a memorandum of understanding with CropLife International, and one was actually concluded. I don't know that it was actually executed or that it ever entered into force, or what kind of activities were done within its remit. But what the impression that it left in many in the field was that the Food and Agriculture Organization, instead of pursuing its mandate of embracing a human rights-based approach to agriculture and dealing with food security and food safety in a manner that's respectful of human rights, instead of doing that, it was courting and becoming quite too close with industry, with an industry association that, as we know, is composed of the manufacturers of pesticides that are sold in markets around the world. And so it has as a mission the advancement of the interests of its corporate members. I would say that this MOU has not had direct impacts on the work that I do in terms of monitoring and reporting on exposure to hazardous substances, but it has put, I think, a lot of questions on the legitimacy and the vision and direction that the UN Food and Agriculture Organization has taken in dealing with pesticides. I also finally get a sense that this MOU, given the backlash, given the hundreds of organizations around the world and peasant movements and social movements that have pushed back, it seems that the FAO changed course and has left this MOU to wither in a desk shelved somewhere.
Okay, interesting. I guess there are a lot of different directions we can go in here, and you guys may have access to some of the Q&A on this. Do you think when we're talking to youth, Dr. Porter, there is a basic understanding of this connection between the petroleum industry and pesticides and the power of corporations over our lives? I know this is taking your history hat off and the fact that you do intersect with a number of groups and folks on the ground, like in Chicago might be the best example. Are you seeing that awareness, and does it matter? Or is there sort of an innate now or an educated belief that the system has failed to protect our communities and us, and we don't want to be a part of that? What level of education is necessary to bring more people along, do you think?
There's for an assortment of different reasons, the education access differs. I think everywhere you'll have students who are informed by their lived experience, which, might not be in every community, but, especially in cities like Chicago or New York, or Baltimore, where, you have so many students I've been working, that are just informed by their own lived experience, things that they've seen their parents go through, things that they're doing, questioning their own relationship with asthma, questioning why they can't get certain foods, that they're asking great questions. And then you also just have students that are just kind of seeking this information out and are just obsessed with it, kids are with dinosaurs and stuff like that, So I definitely think there is a lot of hope there, but I generally think that, there's a lot of there's a lot of you know there's a lot of education that needs to be done, but I don't think youth need to be educated any more than general adult population. So
Yeah. Thank you for that. Dr. Orellana, there's a question here about using litigation as a tool to hit corporations. And I know you've been involved in world trade issues, and you've been in the legal arena, at least, raising legal issues around corporate behavior. Is that a venue that you think is worth a lot of time, given the urgency of our situation and change that's needed?
Yeah, thanks for that. So in the tools available to secure prevention, litigation often follows harm, and so it is often a tool of last resort for either restitution where it's available, injunctions if possible, but most often it's compensation for harm, and that as a matter of remedy. I mean, it certainly has a place in the toolbox, but I want to make all those caveats or considerations in understanding that when we get to litigation, sure, there can be strategic litigation in order to have a broader systemic impacts, and that's very important. But I will say that there need to be other alternatives also on the table, that litigation is not an end-all, above-all, or strategy. It's litigation is expensive. It is often protracted in time. It takes a lot of resources. Companies often have the strategy of wearing communities down to the point that there are divisions, people get tired psychologically, they run out of steam, they run out of resources, and but the companies, they in that sense, they're entities that they're not just one individual or one family or one community. They kind of replicate in time and over time. So the resources available for litigation is an unequal arms, as it were, and even in the United States, that has a strong judiciary, I will say, there are difficulties, a lot of difficulties in accessing a remedy, and so seeing that in context in many other parts of the world, going to court is very hard in terms of proving causation, getting access to the evidence. So in addition to the expense, so litigation definitely very important, very useful, key in many ways to an effective remedy in case of human rights violations, including in respect of corporate responsibilities, but not a panacea by any means.
Yeah. And this next question really goes to maybe the flip side of what is the best institutional mechanism for advancing change, either both historically or in the current day we live in. We see programs, a lot of the programs the public's most aware of, I think, are crisis-driven programs, right? Feeding programs that are born out of crises and displace people from their homelands or wherever, war-torn countries. This is what we are accustomed to seeing and relating to as what international organizations do. But then there are all kinds of funding programs, from private funding programs to UN funding programs to even the US Trade Representative, and those programs have influence, right, on the way people think. So they apply for a grant, but the grant either subtly or, very directly drives pesticide dependency or drives a type of product that might not be traditional to the country or to the community. Are there any examples out there of funding programs that are taking us in the right direction? And this could be to both of you guys.
So perhaps I'll jump in the
Yeah.
first part of your question. So what makes change and what makes lasting change? And I'll point to two things. One is certainly there is the issue of awareness, and that's what I started talking about. The legitimacy of ideas. Once an idea becomes legitimate and there's dissemination, and so there's sharing of knowledge. Communities are able to mobilize and organize in ways that they can press for change, and it's not a kind of a linear process. It's certainly a difficult and convoluted process, but it seems to me that is what drives change, and that is where the work of the mandate that I have now from the UN Human Rights Council is focused on monitoring and reporting, on lessons learned, on sharing of information, and so forth. Let me give you a couple examples. In Brazil, I had the opportunity to appear before a hearing of the Brazilian Parliament in regards to a legal reform that was sought by the previous Bolsonaro administration in order to reduce the competences of the ministries of health and environment in the licensing of new hazardous pesticides, among other various changes, far-reaching changes. And it was through a coordinated campaign of civil society working with land rights defenders, with peasant organizations and so forth. They were able to mobilize opposition, and well, then there was a change in government, and so this bill was in a way frozen. It's now shelved. So that speaks to the power of democracy in that sense, but also, of course, the risks associated. So that's one. And second, an example of change that doesn't last. And take the situation in Sri Lanka, for example, where pesticides were banned from one day to the other by governmental decree, a decree imagined and thought through by the president at the time, without any kind of support, transition plan, without any kind of information, education, buy-in, and so forth. And so the people, the workers, and the farmers in the fields were the first to oppose this, fearing for the food security. That contrasts, for example, with the experience of certain states in India that have transitioned to agroecology, where the state has put in place plans and programs intended to support that transition and support the farmers in getting their produce to the markets and so forth. So I think those examples tell a lot of what drives change, and also where change will not last.
Yeah. The experience in the United States in terms of transition has really been borne by individuals who have really taken on the expense of transitioning to alternative practices. And it took years of that development with alternative markets, farmers markets, buying clubs, co-ops, to create almost an underground food economy, parallel to conventional agriculture. And it was only after decades of this going on that the institution, Congress, embraced this as a voluntary practice that could be certified by the federal government. And now, only now, we are talking about support for farmers to transition and cost share and things that would lend the support of government to recognize that there's a social good, there's an environmental good associated with this transition, and that, you know, the question of environmental justice is really served, and the concerns are really served by transitioning away from the chemicals that are having this disproportionate effect. What you're describing in terms of Sri Lanka and then India, and we've seen similar activities in Malawi, where the infrastructure, there's some sort of support for infrastructure to affect this transition. And it's just nascent in the United States. It doesn't really exist. We don't even have extension service as a rule with a mandate to go out and advance these alternatives in the interest of environmental justice, in the interest of protecting biodiversity. And these are all social goods. And so, you know, I don't know that there's a question in here, but I'm searching for some examples that we can utilize or build on. And building on the base that you mentioned, Dr. Porter, you know, where you've got community activism, you've got an awareness about a threat, and now you have an awareness that we can do something about it. We can actually organize ourselves to fight that threat through gardening programs or educational programs in the community. My biggest fear is that we're not doing this at a fast enough clip, a fast enough pace to keep track with the very things that the UN and other international organizations have identified as pending collapse or pending issues of pandemic. You know, we have, for instance, the pandemic with resistance to antibiotics, which in many ways is being driven by dependency in agriculture on antimicrobials in conventional agriculture, and glyphosate, which is an antibiotic, patented as an antibiotic, that is contributing to antibiotic resistance, let alone insect and other weed resistance, plant resistance. So we've got all this information. Is the UN the mechanism? I guess there's not one mechanism, but how do we pull all the strings together to become a force that meets the challenge, the existential challenges that are in front of us? No answers to those questions, I guess. But, you know, I mean, it's these are large questions, I think, that people are struggling with. And it takes small steps at the community level. It takes these conversations that you're having with governmental bodies and around the world that ultimately will, I think, you know, affect the change that is needed. Go ahead.
I'll say something real quick. Just I've stopped. There was a sugar. I wish I remembered their name. A Black feminist scholar was talking about moving away from the simple future tense towards the future conditional tense. So, things like, a world where harmful pesticides don't exist, or, fighting for a world where, the burdens of environmentalism are equally shared and dispersed, and everyone gets to, benefit in their ways, kind of thing, towards, a more future conditional, that, it'd be what would have had to happen? What would have to happen for harmful pesticides to no longer be, central in our global agricultural, networks? Like what would have had to happen for our politicians and officials to finally have the best interest of poor and marginal people. What would have had to happen? Yes, Tina Camp. Yes, thank you for that. And I think it's just so useful in terms of just not necessarily losing hope in terms of what you can do moving forward. Because maybe what would have had to happen is for us to have these conversations, for me to learn that Dr. Orellana is at American University, where I have a great mentor who has actually worked on pesticides in Mexico for a very, very long time, Jonathan Fox. Maybe what would have had to happen is for someone listening to this to be inspired by, the travels and the work that they've heard in this conversation. So I think I personally don't have very ego driven, this is what I'm going to do to enact this change. I'm pretty insignificant. But I do hold a lot of hope. I do hold a lot of hope in those kind of everyday acts of, kind of resistance. And those kind of everyday acts of trying to make something more livable with the people around you. So I'm very much a localist. I'm very much a you build where you are, where you stand, where you can. And that's what everyone's doing. I think when you meet people constantly exposed to harmful chemicals, you will be inspired with what they do to make it through the day, what they do to still love their family, what they do to still try to find some semblance of love for themselves, right? And I think I have eschewed the inclination to think that someone's gonna come and help, and knock on the door, and I'm constantly inspired by the people who just help themselves, and they do what they think will have had to happen to get that better world for, their kids and their community.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And thank you both for what you do. I think sharing your knowledge and sharing your experience is inspiring, right? And it does help people to take the energy that you bring to your work and bring it to their work as well. All of this starts with individual action, as you say, and really creates the momentum that will bring the change necessary. So we are tremendously appreciative and hope that we can continue the conversation. And I know there are additional questions here that we will get to as a staff and maybe pass some of these by you, if you don't mind. Beyond Pesticides, hopefully is doing some of what you just said, Dr. Porter, and empowering people to take steps in their communities. That those steps become models and inspiration for other people. Nationally and internationally, we learn a lot from communities all over the world and are inspired by people. We're inspired by your travels, Dr. Orellana, and I think they really give us a sense that communication is critical to solving these problems. We also want to be very multidimensional as we work together to bring in the range of knowledge, the range of experience, the range of culture that informs solutions. And that is something we are, and I know people that work with us want to do. So again, want to really thank you for being here today. We will be picking up the next session of this forum in November 29th at 2 p.m., which will be doing a lot of what you're mentioning here, which is empowering local communities to affect change right in their backyard, in their front yards, in their political decision-making, in terms of corporate behavior as well. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We will put this up on our website as a recording, and I'm sure people will be inspired by everything you guys are doing. Thanks so much for joining us today. Any last thoughts? Welcome to say at this point.
Only to thank you, Jay. It's been a real pleasure and privilege to share this conversation with Dr. Porter. I want to also thank Beyond Pesticides for the work you do and for the opportunity to join you today. And I look forward to further opportunities for engagement.
Yes.
All the best. Thank
Also
you.
grateful. Thank you, Dr. Orellana.
Yeah. And again, I know you guys are busy, and I know from tracking you down, Dr. Orellana, you're traveling around the world, and Dr. Porter, you're going, meeting with universities and youth. And so again, really appreciate the time you've given to us today, and safe travels, and let us know how we can be of any assistance to you as you continue your path forward. Thank you all. Take care.